The late afternoon sun spilled across the slow-moving river, turning the water into molten gold. It was the kind of forgotten place where time felt heavy, where voices carried too far and where silence clung after laughter died. Two boys wandered along the banks, chasing the last hours of summer with a pocket full of smooth stones. "Bet mine skips farther," one said, his voice light, careless. The other only smirked, sending a rock gliding 5 times across the water before it sank. Their games were innocent, but fate does not wait for innocence. The first boy bent to pick up another stone, and his hand caught on a loop of fishing line tangled in the reeds. He tugged, frowning as the line resisted. The more he pulled, the more the river seemed determined to keep its secret. Finally, something gave way, and a small, heavy shape broke the surface, dripping with mud and moss. It wasn't a fish. It was metal. The boys turned it over in their palms, confused. The chain was knotted, its links rusted almost black. Dangling from it were 2 thin plates, their surfaces worn and pitted but still etched with faint letters. The older boy squinted, reading aloud. "Hayes, Daniel R." The name hung in the air like a ghost. Neither child understood what they had found, but the weight of it silenced their game. One of them muttered, "We should tell someone." And so they did. By dusk, sheriff's deputies had sealed the riverbank with yellow tape. Flashlights cut through the growing darkness, their beams glinting off the rusted tags as they were bagged and cataloged. The boys stood off to the side, nervous, watching adults turn their discovery into something grave. Within hours, the dog tags had been traced. Private First Class Daniel Hayes, United States Army, declared missing in 1969. His service records listed him as absent without leave. Rumors suggesting desertion, whispers of betrayal, but his file ended abruptly, a bureaucratic silence swallowing the truth. Nobody had ever been recovered, no trace found. Until now. Reporters arrived quickly, their voices sharp against the hush of the river. Cameras snapped as though the rusted tags themselves could bleed out answers. 40 years, one murmured, and he was just here. An older man in uniform, retired now but once Daniel's comrade, stared at the bagged tags with trembling hands. "He didn't run," he whispered. "He would never have run." His voice cracked on the last word. The sheriff spoke carefully to the press, but his eyes betrayed unease. "We're reopening the investigation," he announced. "This isn't just lost property. This is a man's life, unfinished." As the night deepened, the river carried on as it always had, dark and indifferent, its currents whispering secrets only bones could tell. For 40 years, Daniel Hayes had been nothing more than a name fading in family stories and military files. Now his presence returned, not as a soldier, not as a deserter, but as a mystery demanding to be heard. And somewhere between the rust and the silence, the truth waited to surface. The dog tags lay sealed in a plastic evidence bag, but they carried more than rust and silence. They carried a story unfinished. To understand what happened, investigators, and soon the audience of whispers, looked backward. Back to the year 1969, when the world was different. But the shadows were the same. It was a humid summer night, and Fort Willow's barracks pulsed with the restless noise of men too young to carry the weight on their shoulders. Radios hummed protest songs and crackled news from Vietnam. Cigarette smoke curled through the air, mixing with laughter that felt forced, brittle. Daniel Hayes sat apart from the others. He was 22, handsome in a way that came from discipline, not vanity. But his eyes betrayed him. They were tired, restless, carrying storms that no uniform could iron flat. In his hand was a folded letter, the paper creased so many times it was nearly torn. He read it again, lips moving silently. The words were not kind. "Hayes," a fellow soldier called from across the room. "You heading out tonight?" Daniel tucked the letter into his pocket. "Yeah, just for a while." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. He left the base under the cover of darkness, boots crunching gravel. The night thick with the smell of pine and the faint hum of cicadas. Each step felt rehearsed, as though he knew this walk was different from all others. His leave pass allowed him off post, but his destination wasn't a bar or a diner like the others. It was a meeting. A reckoning. On the outskirts of town, where the road narrowed and the field swallowed the horizon, a car waited. Its headlights were off, its silhouette barely visible against the trees. Daniel hesitated. the weight of choice pressing down on him before stepping forward. The driver's door opened. A figure emerged. Daniel. The voice was familiar, soft yet strained. Evelyn, his fiancée. Her presence should have steadied him, but instead it deepened the tremor in his chest. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to carry both longing and fear. "You came," she whispered. He studied her in silence, searching her face for the truth he both needed and dreaded. Then finally he spoke. "Why did you write it?" His hand brushed the pocket where the letter hid like a wound. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any confession. Daniel stepped closer, anger flickering beneath his calm exterior. "Do you think I wouldn't find out? Do you think I wouldn't know?" She flinched, but before she could answer, another sound cut the night. The low growl of another engine approaching, tires grinding gravel. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the road, terror flashing across her face. Daniel turned, watching the second car pull to a stop, its presence heavy, commanding. The door creaked open. A man stepped out, his figure taller, broader, his authority unmistakable even in shadow. "Hayes," the man said evenly, his voice carrying both familiarity and threat. Daniel's jaw tightened. His hand closed around the tags that hung against his chest, a soldier's last anchor to identity. The air between the three of them thickened with unspoken truths. Betrayal coiling like smoke. The night swallowed their words. But the river would remember. The second car's arrival lingered like a bruise in memory. Investigators in 2009 pieced together fragments of testimony, each spoken in hushed tones, each carrying the weight of secrets never meant to surface. They wanted to know who Daniel met that night and why he never returned. It began with voices from the past. Detectives sat in a modest kitchen across from Margaret Hayes, Daniel's younger sister. She was in her 60s now, silver hair tied back, eyes dimmed by years but sharpened with memory. She poured tea with hands that trembled, as though afraid the past might spill over with the steam. "I was the last one he spoke to before he left," she said, staring into her cup. "He came to me that afternoon. He was different, nervous, angry." Her voice cracked. "He told me Evelyn wasn't who she seemed, that she was keeping something from him." The detective leaned forward. "What kind of secret?" Margaret's eyes welled. "An affair." The word landed like glass shattering on tile. According to Margaret, Daniel had discovered letters, hidden but not well enough, between Evelyn and someone else. The handwriting wasn't hers, the tone too commanding, too intimate. Daniel never said the man's name aloud, but his fury was unmistakable. "He loved her," Margaret whispered, tears slipping down her face. That's what made it so cruel. He wanted to believe he was wrong, that it was some mistake. But deep down he knew. He knew she was lying. The detectives listened, recording every syllable. For 40 years, silence had been Margaret's prison. Now the words flowed like confession, heavy with guilt that she hadn't spoken sooner. In the town, whispers began to spread once more, carried by old soldiers and aging bartenders who still remembered 1969. Some recalled seeing Daniel arguing with Evelyn outside a diner days before he vanished. Others claimed Evelyn had been seen in the company of Captain Richard Monroe, Daniel's commanding officer, a man with influence, a man untouchable. The rumors tangled together, no longer just gossip but a tapestry of betrayal. Evelyn, the grieving fiancée who wore Daniel's picture close to her chest for years, was suddenly cast in a new, darker light. If she had loved another, had she also known what became of Daniel? The sheriff's notes captured the unease of the community. Town divided. Half say Evelyn's innocent, half say she lured him out that night. All agree, Daniel was betrayed. The investigators knew what must come next. Evelyn herself. Her name now pulsed at the center of the case like a wound that refused to close. If the dog tags had reopened the story, Evelyn's testimony would either stitch it together or tear it wide open. As Margaret wiped her tears, she looked up at the detectives. Her voice was barely audible, but it cut the silence like a blade. "Ask her. She knows more than she's ever admitted." Outside, the river rolled on, carrying echoes of Daniel's last night, as though urging the living to confront the lies buried for 4 decades. Finally, Evelyn Hart lived in a house that seemed frozen in time. The curtains were faded, the wallpaper peeling, yet everything felt meticulously placed, as if moving even one object would unravel the fragile order she had clung to for decades. When the detectives arrived, she greeted them with the cautious smile of a woman long practiced at surviving questions. She was 70 now. Her once golden hair turned brittle gray, but there was still something striking about her presence, a steel hidden beneath the frailty. "Of course I remember Daniel," she said, her voice soft, practiced, almost too calm. She gestured for them to sit, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "He was going to be my husband, my whole world back then." The detectives exchanged glances. They had heard another version of Evelyn, one wrapped in betrayal, whispered in the corners of bars, and remembered by Daniel's sister through tears. One detective leaned forward. "Mrs. Hart, do you remember the night he disappeared?" Her smile faltered. Just a flicker, but enough. She lowered her gaze to the rug. "Yes, he was restless, angry. He left the base to meet me. But he never showed. It was a careful sentence. Too careful. Others recall seeing you together," the detective pressed. Evelyn's head snapped up, eyes wide, panic flickering like lightning. For a heartbeat, her composure cracked. Then she smoothed it over, lips trembling into another faint smile. "People remember what they want to remember." The room thickened with silence. The detectives let it stretch, let the weight of it press down on her until she began to shift in her chair. Finally, one spoke again. "Mrs. Hart, we know Daniel believed you were keeping something from him. Was there someone else?" Her hands clenched in her lap. For the first time, the mask slipped. "I loved him," she said sharply, almost pleading. "You have to understand that. Whatever else people say, I loved him." Her voice dropped, cracking under the strain. "But love doesn't erase mistakes." The detectives leaned in, sensing the fracture. "What mistakes?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to blink away. "I was young, confused. He was gone so often, and I—" She stopped herself, shaking her head violently. No, it doesn't matter. Daniel's the one who mattered. He always did." Her words hung in the air, half-truths wrapped in guilt. The detectives didn't press further, not yet. But her reaction confirmed what they already suspected. Evelyn had been lying for 40 years. As they stood to leave, one of them paused in the doorway. "Mrs. Hart, if there's something you've been hiding, now is the time. This isn't going away." Evelyn turned her face away, staring at the mantel where a faded photograph of Daniel still stood, his uniform crisp, his smile steady. She whispered, almost too softly to hear. "He wasn't supposed to find out." The detectives exchanged a glance. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. When they stepped back into the fading daylight, one of them muttered under his breath, "She's not telling us everything. Not even close." And though Evelyn remained inside, clutching her secrets like lifelines, the investigation's path was already shifting toward another figure, one whose name had surfaced again and again in the shadows. Captain Richard Monroe. Captain Richard Monroe's name carried weight, even after 4 decades. To some, he was a decorated officer, a man who commanded respect and discipline. To others, he was a ghost who had slipped quietly out of town after Daniel Hayes vanished, leaving behind rumors thick as smoke. The detectives found him in a quiet suburb 2 hours away, living in a brick house trimmed with perfect hedges. At 74, his frame was stooped, but there was still authority in his posture, a sharpness in his eyes that years hadn't dulled. He answered the door reluctantly, as though he'd been expecting this knock for 40 years. "You want to talk about Hayes?" he said before the detectives even introduced themselves. His voice was low, steady, almost rehearsed. Inside, his living room was neat to the point of sterility. No family photos. No clutter. Just military plaques on the wall, polished but lifeless reminders of a career that had ended abruptly. "We've recovered his dog tags," one detective said. "We're reopening the investigation." Monroe's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing at the news. For a moment, the facade of calm slipped, replaced by something colder. Fear, perhaps, or anger carefully leashed. "I told the Army everything I knew back then," he said flatly. "Daniel Hayes went AWOL, that's all." But his voice lacked conviction. The detectives laid out what they had. Evelyn's evasive answers, Margaret's memories, the whispers of an affair. Monroe's name kept surfacing, bound to Evelyn's like threads in a knot. "Were you involved with her?" one detective asked directly. Monroe's face hardened. "That's none of your business." "On the contrary," the detective replied. "It's exactly our business if it connects to why Hayes never came home." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Monroe rose to his feet, pacing to the mantel where a small wooden box sat. He opened it with deliberate slowness and removed a stack of old letters, the edges yellowed with time. He held them like a man weighing whether to burn them or surrender them. Finally, he set them down on the table between them. The detectives unfolded the brittle pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's, but the addressee was Monroe. The words bled longing, desperation, forbidden love. When you look at me, I forget the world outside, but Daniel suspects. He watches me differently now. Monroe's voice broke the silence. We cared for each other, more than I ever should have allowed. But she was mine long before Hayes knew it. The detectives exchanged a glance. The affair was no longer a rumor. It was truth inked in Evelyn's own hand. Did Hayes confront you? One asked. Monroe's eyes flickered, betraying the memory of that summer night. He opened his mouth, then closed it, swallowing whatever truth threatened to escape. I don't know what happened to him, he said finally, though his trembling hands betrayed the lie. But if you think Evelyn is innocent, you don't know her at all. The detectives gathered the letters, their evidence growing heavier. For the first time, the case felt less like a puzzle and more like a confession waiting to be forced into daylight. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the horizon, the air thick with the smell of rain. Soon the river itself would be searched, its depth stirred for secrets long buried. Because if dog tags had surfaced after 40 years, what else might the current still be holding? The storm that had threatened all afternoon broke by dawn. Rain hammered the valley, feeding the river until its current ran fast and mean as though stirred awake by the voices of the past. It was here, beneath the swollen waters, that detectives believed Daniel Hayes' story remained unfinished. The sheriff authorized a full search. Divers arrived in black wetsuits, their gear gleaming in the weak light. Locals gathered on the banks, umbrellas dotting the shoreline like mourners at a funeral. The air carried a hush, as if even the river demanded silence for what was about to be uncovered. A diver slipped beneath the surface, vanishing into the murk. Minutes stretched into eternity until he emerged again, clutching something small. It wasn't bones, not yet, but it was a watch, its glass face cracked, its strap rotted, its hands frozen at 11:47. The crowd whispered. A soldier's watch. Daniel's? Another diver surfaced later with fragments stranger still. Splintered bone caught in the silt, impossibly preserved. They were fragile, almost unrecognizable, but the forensic team handled them with reverence. Each shard was placed into evidence bags labeled with the care one gives to relics of the dead. Reporters leaned over the barriers, their voices sharp, but none could mask the growing truth. This was no desertion. Daniel Hayes hadn't run. He had been buried here piece by piece beneath 40 years of silence. Margaret Hayes stood among the onlookers, her hand pressed to her mouth. The sight of the divers resurfacing again and again shattered her composure. She had prayed for decades that her brother had escaped, built a life somewhere far away. Now the river gave her no illusions. One detective placed a hand gently on her shoulder. We'll find the rest. We'll give him back to you. But Margaret only shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Daniel didn't belong to the river. He belonged here. Someone put him there. Her words cut deep because everyone listening knew she was right. Bones didn't crawl into currents. Dog tags didn't tangle themselves in fishing line. Someone had chosen the river as Daniel's grave. As the day wore on, the divers packed their gear, promising to return. The river, swollen and angry, seemed reluctant to release more. But it had given enough to force the case wide open. The detectives knew where to turn next, not to the water, but to the people who had lived with these secrets for decades. And there was one person who had held her silence too long. Margaret Hayes. She had given them whispers before. But the look in her eyes now said she carried more. Much more. Margaret Hayes had sat quietly through every interview, answering with half-truths and carefully measured words. But after the river gave up its fragments, something inside her cracked. The detectives returned to her modest home, and this time she didn't try to hide behind teacups or trembling hands. She sat at her kitchen table, eyes fixed on nothing, as though speaking to ghosts. I should have told you sooner, she began, her voice hoarse. But I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of who it would destroy. The detectives waited. They knew the weight of silence better than most. Margaret drew in a shaky breath. The night Daniel left the base, he came to me first. He was restless, like a man carrying fire in his chest. He said he had proof. Proof that Evelyn and Captain Monroe were together. Her lips trembled around the word. He said they'd been meeting in secret. That he had letters. The detectives exchanged a glance. The letters had already surfaced in Monroe's possession, confirming her claim. But Margaret wasn't finished. He told me he was going to confront them. That night. Her voice broke, but she pressed on, her confession pouring out like water long trapped behind a dam. He said he was tired of being lied to, that he wasn't going to let them ruin him, not anymore. What exactly did he say? One detective asked gently. Margaret's eyes glistened as she repeated his words, burned into her memory like a brand. They won't bury me. I'll bury them first. Silence filled the room. The detectives wrote the words down slowly, knowing their weight. They weren't just angry promises. They were prophecy. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. I begged him not to go. I told him to wait, to think. But he was already gone in his mind. He kissed my forehead, said I was the only one who ever truly believed in him. And then he walked out the door. That was the last time I saw my brother alive. Tears streaked her cheeks. She pressed her fist to her mouth, stifling a sob. For 40 years I kept that to myself. I thought, maybe he really had deserted. Maybe I imagined it. But I didn't. He knew. He was going to expose them. And that's why he never came back. The detectives let her cry, the truth settling heavy in the air. Her confession didn't just paint Evelyn and Monroe as liars, it gave them motive, desperation, fear. Enough to drive a man into the river and bury the truth beneath decades of silence. When Margaret finally looked up, her voice was a whisper. If you want justice for Daniel, you'll have to break them. Both of them. They swore to keep each other's secrets. That's the only way they survived. The detectives closed their notebooks, their course clear. Monroe had already cracked when confronted with the letters. Evelyn had already slipped when faced with her lies. Now it was time to confront the man who had held command that summer night. Captain Robert Monroe had built his life on silence. After the war, after the rumors, after Daniel Hayes vanished, he learned the value of keeping his lips sealed and his records clean. For 40 years, he carried the image of an untouchable officer, stern, disciplined, the kind of man who lived by regulations. But when the detectives came knocking again, Monroe wasn't the soldier he used to be. His hands trembled as he poured a glass of whiskey, and his once commanding voice wavered when he tried to sound dismissive. I already told you everything, he said, staring into the amber liquid. Hayes went AWOL. He was unstable. End of story. But the detectives didn't leave. One placed Margaret's statement on the table between them. Her words, written out in black ink, sat like a loaded weapon. Monroe's jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the page. She's lying, he muttered. She was always too close to him, blinded by her loyalty. Then the second detective slid another envelope across the table. The letters. Hayes's handwriting. The proof of Evelyn's affair with Monroe. The captain's breath caught. His fingers twitched against the paper, but he didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what was inside. You were warned, Captain, the detective said softly. Hayes threatened to expose you. His sister confirms it. The night he vanished, you had everything to lose. Monroe's composure cracked. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. For the first time in decades, the truth clawed its way past the walls he'd built. You don't understand, he rasped. You think this was about Evelyn, about some foolish affair? No, it was bigger than that. Hayes wasn't just going to expose me. He was going to tear the whole unit apart. He wanted revenge. And if he had gone through with it, every man under my command would have been ruined. His voice broke, the old authority dissolving into desperation. He gripped the glass so tightly it nearly shattered in his hand. I tried to reason with him. I told him to walk away, to forget it. But he wouldn't listen. He laughed in my face, called me a coward, said he'd see me stripped of my rank by morning. The detectives leaned closer. And what happened then? Monroe's eyes, bloodshot and weary, lifted from the table. For a moment he looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, torn between falling and clinging to the ledge. His lips trembled, forming words that refused to come. Finally he whispered, I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to scare him, make him back down. But once we were by the river, once the shouting started, there was no stopping it. The room went silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Monroe closed his eyes as if seeing it all again, the water, the struggle, the final silence that followed. When he opened them, a single tear slid down his cheek. It should have been me in that river. Not him. The detectives exchanged a look. They had their break. But Monroe's words hinted at more, something still hidden beneath the current. And the river, silent for 40 years, was not finished giving up its secrets. The river had been silent for 4 decades, carrying its secrets beneath the shifting currents and thick silt. But after Monroe's trembling confession, the detectives knew exactly where to look. His half-formed words, "once we were by the river," became a compass. Autumn had stripped the trees bare when they returned to the bend of the river Monroe once patrolled. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth, and the current lapped against the banks as if mocking their intrusion. A forensic team spread out along the shoreline, boots sinking into the mud, metal detectors sweeping in arcs across the water's edge. At first, there was only the hollow chatter of radios and the mechanical hum of equipment. Then came the shout, "Over here!" A young technician stood knee-deep in water, his gloved hands pulling something from beneath the muck. It was the curve of a rusted metal buckle, tangled in rotted leather straps, the remains of a military issue belt. The river was beginning to speak. Hours later, a diver emerged from the water carrying a bundle wrapped carefully in a tarp. The crowd fell silent as it was laid on the grass, bones brittle and stained by years of sediment. The last fragments of Private Daniel Hayes, Detective Carter, who had chased this ghost of a case longer than most thought wise, crouched near the remains. His eyes were fixed on a jagged fracture along the ribcage. "This wasn't just drowning," he murmured. "This was violence." Whispers rippled through the onlookers. The medical examiner confirmed what Monroe's conscience had tried to bury. Hayes had fought back. His body bore the marks of a struggle. Broken ribs, a fractured jaw, bruising still visible in the discoloration of ancient bone. He hadn't simply vanished. He had been silenced. Margaret was brought to the river that evening. The woman who had spent her life clinging to shadows now stood at the edge of the water, hands trembling as she reached toward the recovered remains. "Danny," her voice cracked like dry wood. "I told them you weren't the kind to run. I told them." Her grief echoed off the trees. For the first time, the river didn't feel like a barrier of silence. It felt like a graveyard giving back what it had stolen. Captain Monroe was informed of the discovery that same night. Sitting in a cold interrogation room, he listened as the evidence was read to him piece by piece. His shoulders sagged lower with every word. "It's over, Captain," the detective said. "The river gave him back." Monroe let out a hollow laugh, bitter and broken. 40 years, he whispered. "And all it takes is a current to undo a man." Outside, the river moved on as if indifferent to the lives it had ruined. But the case that once seemed destined to rot in silence was now alive with truth, and truth demanded its final chapter. The trial of Captain Robert Monroe never made national headlines. By 2010, the world was too distracted with fresher scandals, newer wars, and louder crimes. But in the quiet town where Daniel Hayes' name had lived in whispers for 40 years, the courthouse steps filled with faces, some demanding justice, some defending the old officer who had once been their war hero. Inside, the air was heavy with age and consequence. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands clutching a handkerchief so tightly it tore at the seams. She had waited a lifetime for this moment, yet as Monroe entered in shackles, her chest ached with something far more complicated than relief. This was the man who had destroyed her brother, but also the man who had carried his ghost for decades. The prosecutor painted Monroe as a man ruled by jealousy and fear. The letters, the affair, the threats Hayes made, they laid the pieces like a puzzle, each fitting neatly until the picture was unmistakable. Murder by rage and desperation, but the defense fought back, painting Hayes as unstable, reckless, a danger to himself and others. They tried to reframe the river not as a grave, but as an accident. 2 men clashing, tempers rising, tragedy striking in a single irrevocable moment. Monroe himself took the stand. His voice was weary, stripped of command. "I never planned to kill him," he confessed, eyes cast downward. "He was like a fire I couldn't contain. And when he threatened to expose me, I snapped. I thought if I could silence him even just for a moment, I could protect everything. My career. My family, my men. But all I did was damn myself. Silence fell over the courtroom. His words carried no excuses, only the hollow ring of a man who had been running from himself longer than anyone knew. When the verdict came guilty of manslaughter, the gavel struck like a final heartbeat. Monroe closed his eyes and nodded, as if welcoming the weight of it at last. Margaret wept quietly, not for him, but for the brother she had lost, for the wasted years, for the truth that had come too late to save anyone. She whispered almost to herself, "You're free now. Danny, they can't bury you anymore." As the courtroom emptied, Detective Carter lingered by the window watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. Cases rarely ended this cleanly. Most secrets stayed buried. Most rivers never gave back their dead. Yet here, in the strange convergence of guilt and fate, the truth had clawed its way to the surface. That night, Margaret returned to the river one last time. She dropped fresh flowers into the current and watched them drift downstream, carried by the same water that had once stolen everything from her. For the first time, she didn't see it as her enemy. It was her brother's witness, his keeper, his grave and his revelation. The river whispered against the rocks, eternal and indifferent, and as the flowers disappeared into the dark, Margaret turned away, finally ready to live in the shadow of truth rather than the silence of lies.